Let me ask you a question as we get started. Do you love people? This is why we're preaching on love. My house last night was not a house filled with love. Last night my house was filled with anger and yelling to the point that all 4 of my kids were in their beds crying. This is your pastor. And there was a genuine lack of love demonstrated. And yet, the paramount distinctive of the Christian life is love. It is the last garment that Paul says in Colossians 3 that is to be put on, that binds together all the ethical traits of Jesus' followers. Jesus said, I'm giving you a new commandment, that you would love one another, that you would actually, in your love, prove to the world that you're my disciples. Paul says of faith, hope, and love, love is the greatest. Why? Probably because love is eternal. When the new creation comes, faith will become sight, hope will be fulfilled, and yet love will continue. Love is the fountain from which all other virtues flow, such that if you don't have love, you have nothing. And so in 1 John chapter 4, this morning, starting in verse 7, John says this, Dear friends, let us love one another. Why? Because love comes from God, and everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. This is how God showed his love among us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. And this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. So, dear friends, since God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. We're in a series called The Discipleship Life, and last week we looked at the 3 loves the Bible commands us to have, is to love God, and when we love God, we love God's people, and we also begin to love people who are not yet part of God's family. And this morning, I want to dig into that second circle of what it means to love God's people, to love one another, from this passage in 1 John chapter 4. And so, as we begin this morning, in 1 John 4, I want us to begin looking at this. Love, John says, is the defining mark of knowing God. Look in verse 7 again. Dear friends, let us love one another. Here's a command. We are called to love one another because love is from God. We are told here that to be God's people, we are to be people who are characterized by love. Why? This is a very weird connection. We are called to love. Why? Because love comes from God. Most of the time we think we should love. Why? Because it's nice. We should love. Why? Because it helps others. And yet here John gives the basis of our love for one another is because God is the person that love comes from, such that the source of love is God. Love must come from God. And he says, go on to say that everyone who has been born of God and knows God. The idea here is that to truly love is to know God. If you don't know God, you can't love. I love how black and white John is. He says, whoever does not love does not know God. There's not like debate. There's not like caveats. There's not like degrees. There's just this basic premise. To love is to know God, and to not love is to not know God. Know here obviously does not mean simply an intellectual awareness, that we are simply aware that God exists, so that if we know that God exists and that He's out there, we can be loving people. No, that's not what John is getting after. The idea of what it means to know God has this intimate, personal, relational experience with Him. To know God is to experience Him, to be in a relationship with Him, to communicate with Him. And since God is the source of love, if you don't know Him, you don't know who He is and how He relates to you, you don't know what God's love is. John goes on to say at the end of verse 8 there, because God is love. God is love. There is something about God's nature that makes love a necessary part of who He is. So God defines love. God is love. And if it's necessary and inherent to the very nature of God, what I want to say is that this inherent quality of love was in God and with God before He ever made the worlds. But how can God be loving before He ever made the world? How could God love you before you were ever made? John gives us the answer, just not in this book. He gives it to us in his gospel in John chapter 17. And in John chapter 17, verse 24, it's on the screen. Jesus is praying. And the prayer gets a little wordy here, so we're going to slow it down a little bit and make sure we catch it. Jesus says, Father, I want those you have given me to be with me where I am. Okay, some of you need to hear that again. Jesus wants you to be with Him. Okay, that's crazy in and of itself. All right? You get to hang out with me for more than 6 minutes, you don't want to be around me. And I don't want to be around you. Yet the author of your life, the perfecter of your faith, says, God, Father, I want those who you've given me to be with me. And when they're with me, I want them to see, to experience my glory. The glory you have given me, and notice this next phrase, because you loved me when? Before the creation of the world. Such that before the creation of the world, God can be love and be loving because there was this relationship between the Father and the Son, in which the Son can say, Father, you have loved me before the creation of the world. And that love that I've experienced, which, by the way, is probably experienced because we're Trinitarian, is by the Spirit. So that the Spirit is the person that is flowing between the Father and the Son, in which that love is being communicated. Jesus is saying, I want my followers to actually experience that love. He goes on to say, I've made you known to them. He's saying, I've revealed you. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father, Jesus says. And I'm going to continue to make you known. And by the way, how is Jesus continuing to make the Father known to us today? Through His Spirit. Through the Trinitarian love that He has sent into us. So Paul can say in Romans chapter 5 that the Spirit of God has brought the love of God into our hearts. I'm continuing to make you known, Father, to them. Why? In order that the love you have for me may be in them, and that I myself may be in them. What's John saying? John is saying to love is to know God because God is love. To be caught up into this Trinitarian love is what the Spirit enables us to do, is be swept up into God's life. The love that God has for Jesus is the same love that is in us. It is an infinite love. It is a supernatural love. So I'll repeat again. If you do not love, you show that you don't know God. You don't understand Him. You don't experience Him. You don't know the relationship that the Father has with the Son. You have not been swept up into that by the Spirit of God, and you don't know God. 1 John 2, earlier in the book, he says, if we say we know Him, but don't obey him, we're a liar. And this is the same here. You're a liar, you're deceiving yourself if you say that you love and don't know God. So what about people who don't know God? Can they still love? This is a question I have. A person who doesn't follow Jesus, a disciple of Jesus, who has not been swept up into God's love, can they not love? Say a couple things. One, there are things that we call love, which people do, which do not stem from the knowledge of God, which do not come from being born of God, but are loves that are born and come from sexual desire and natural affections or even philanthropic aspirations. What that means is, I believe that other people who do not know God can mimic God's love, but they cannot experience it, and they can only do it in partial ways. See, John says to love is to know God and to be born of God. This is a familiar phrase if you're familiar with the book of John, Gospel of John. It says, to all who believe in him, he gave the right to become born of God. Or John, he says that we need to be born again with Nicodemus. See, to be born of God is a supernatural work of the Spirit. So to be born of God, to love others because you know God, is a supernatural quality. What I would say is this, is what matters is a love that only God can produce in you, in which you then demonstrate that love to others. There is a kind of love that when you see it, the only explanation is what? God. That is the love we're talking about. Not the easy ways of love, not the philanthropic ways of love, not the sexual desire aspect of love. We are looking at love that we could actually look at someone, at a body, as a church, and say there must be something supernatural about the way they love. Without that supernatural explanation, I don't know that we really are loving people the way that God is calling us to love. So I ask you, do you have a love that is supernatural in these ways? Do you love those who are truly not like you? I think I have these on the next screen. Questions for you to be thinking through. Do you like people who are not like you? Whether that be anything from race to age to socioeconomic incomes. Do you have a supernatural explanation for why you love people who are not like you? Do you love those who cannot repay you? And they may not repay you with money, but they may repay you with attention and approval. Do you do good to those who hate you? Okay, if you're living godly in Jesus, you will face persecution. And in 1 John chapter 3, he actually says, when you love others, don't be surprised that the world hates you. Do good to those who hate you. Do you bless those who gossip about you? The natural response of the human heart is when others speak ill of you is to do what? But there's a supernatural explanation when others who speak ill of you, and you go on to bless them and to speak well of them. Do you give your time and money to others? See, what I'm getting after is this, is that people who don't know God, they can mimic God, they can have certain aspects of God's love, because I think it's part of God's image to all of creation. But what John is getting at here is to be born of God, to know God, is a demonstration. There is a supernatural work in the life of God's people that can only be explained because of God. This is my desire for Redemption Church. That we would be people who know God, who deeply experience Him, that we could actually look at ourselves and say the only way we can explain what's happening is because there's a supernatural Spirit of God at work in our hearts. When we look at our church, can we say there's a love amongst us that can only be explained by the supernatural work of the Spirit among us? And I would say yes, but I'd say it needs to grow. It needs to increase more and more and more. So if you say you know God and you hate your brothers, you don't know God. If you say you know God and there's no supernatural love that is actually at work in you, you're not born of God. No matter how much Bible you have memorized, no matter how much theology you possess, if you don't possess a supernatural love for God, you don't know Him. 1 John chapter 4, when it comes to being a disciple of Jesus, John is telling us the defining mark that marks us is our love for one another. But secondly, love is tethered to actions. Love is connected and tied to activity. So at this point, we need to stop and come back and actually say, what is love? And define love. If love is a supernatural work, what is this love that we're talking about? Now, please don't mishear me. Love is a feeling, but it's far more than a feeling. Love is an attitude, but it's far more than an attitude. Love is speaking, but it is far more than speaking. Because love is not simply a matter of speaking, it's not a matter of feeling, it's not a matter of attitude, but it is a matter of laying down your life for other in tangible, active ways. John says in 1 John chapter 3, this is love, that Jesus came and laid down His life for us. There's a sacrificial activity in tangible, active ways. 1 John chapter 3, verse 18, John says this, dear children, don't let us just love in words or speech, but with activity, with actions. Love requires actions. It involves our lives being connected to others in tangible ways so the Spirit can produce some supernatural activity among us. When God, who is love, says He loves us, it's interesting, every time in the New Testament where God says He loves us, maybe there is one, but I haven't found it yet, it is always followed or preceded by Jesus' work for us. Which means the paramount way that God says He loves us is not just a book that says, I love you. It's not just this feeling He has for you, but it is this tangible activity that He says, this is love. I have sent my Son to give you life. What this shows us is that love is an active commitment to seek each other's good. When you look in 1 John chapter 4, and we continue in verse, I believe, 9, it says, no one, I should actually get in chapter 4, that'd be helpful. Chapter 4, verse 9, this is how God showed His love among us. He sent His one and only Son into the world. Why? That we might live through Him. God demonstrates, actively, tangibly, says, I love you by the sending of His Son so that we might live, so that we might have life. What I would actually tell us when it comes to love is this, is that love is a commitment that you're going to give of yourself for the better of other people. To seek the good of other people at the expense of your own good. This is what God did for us in Jesus. He sent Jesus as an active commitment to give us life. Now, what is life? Is life eternal golf? Is life eternal sex? Eternal soccer? Eternal Netflix? How do you define life? John defines it this way in John chapter 17. It's on the screen. He says, now this is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ whom you have sent. Jesus says life that is truly life is a life of knowing God. Okay, can you see the circle John is forming here? To know God is to love God, and then loving God gives you life. And what is life? It's knowing God. This knowledge of God is poured out in a life of self-sacrificial, life-giving love towards others. See, when you come to know God, you experience the life of God. And that life of God wells up within you that overflows to other people. And that is the supernatural love at work in us by the power of the spirits. So let me give you a few ways as we close this morning to love one another that produces life. What are ways that we can produce life in each other and actually have a supernatural work of the Spirit produced in our family here so that we could be characterized by love, by knowing God? And I went a little old school Baptist. I'm going to have 3 P's for you. Okay? Number 1, the first way we can produce life in other people is to love one another in presence. Now, we just got done with Christmas, not Christmas presents. Okay, but presence, you being with people. Love one another in presence. Love without this presence betrays the gospel and love itself. God sent Jesus so that he might live in you. God's love then fills you. His Spirit indwells you. God's presence is intimately tied to love in action. You being present with someone else doesn't just necessarily mean love is going to be there. But true love does demand that you actually be present with them. What if God just said he loved you but was never with you? Would that be true love? No, in fact, there is such a love of God for you that he says, I will never leave you, and I am never going to forsake you. What if God only loved you from a distance? It's impossible, because God actually broke through that distance by sending Jesus so that you and I might know and be present with God. And we are present with God by his Spirit. God delights to be in you. He lives in you. And this is how we come to know and experience him, namely because he is in us. And when you come to experience the presence of God in your life and you know that presence, doesn't that fill you with love and wonder at the Creator God of the universe? And then to actually, the supernatural work of the Spirit is then for you to let go of your schedule, to let go of your hobbies, to let go of your money, and to go be with people. One of the things I've regularly encouraging people with lately, and I'm trying to encourage my own life with, is this. How can you help people? How can you love people? Just show up. Just be present. You're like, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. I'm awkward. Who cares? I don't have time. Make time. Christianity, this is really simplistic, but a famous old preacher said it, 90% of Christianity is just showing up. Just being present. Because when you're in those difficult moments, in those seasons of doubt, in those seasons of suffering, you want people to be there. Even if they don't say anything to you. Even if they say dumb things. You can just, well, I'd just tell you to shut up, but. See, don't be afraid you don't know what to say. Don't be afraid to go into an awkward situation. If there's going to be yelling and screaming, it's okay. If we're going to love people, And we've been caught up into the supernatural life and the love of God where He is always present with us. And we want to produce life-giving ways to love other people. Just show up. Just be there. And yet, isn't that one of the hardest things to do in our culture? Which leads me into my second point. Not only love one another in presence, but love one another in purpose. Love purposefully. God knows what we need before we ever ask Him, thankfully, right? God in Jesus has come to us. He took the active role. He took the initiative to come and meet our deepest needs of to be loved and to have belonging and to have meaning. When you were far from Him and not His child, He didn't come by and say to you, you know, I'm sorry your life is a mess. If there's anything I can do, let me know. No. He came running to you. He put Himself on a cross for you. He took all of the torture and the mocking and the shame and came running to you. And He took the initiative and said, your life is meaningless and empty, and I'm going to fill it with the love and the life of God. God was not passive in coming to you to fill you with His presence. He sent Jesus. He was active. He said, I'm coming to claim my child, and I'm going to plunder Satan's dominion of darkness. And I'm going to fill him with my presence and my joy and my peace. Or as John says in the next verse in 1 John chapter 4, I am sending my Son to be the atoning sacrifice to take care of your sin. This is love. Not that we love God, but that He loved us. So what does it look like to love on purpose? It means this, and just hear me out for a few minutes, okay? Like, just don't start leaving or chucking things at me. Regularly I hear the phrase, if I can do anything, let me know. Are we all guilty of that phrase? Yeah. And I think sometimes it's sincere, and sometimes it's just a phrase we say, right? Be fair, sometimes the sentence is, like I said, given with deep love and genuineness. But let's back up a second. Is there something you can do? Do you really think there's nothing you can do? Do you think you have nothing to offer someone else? Do you think there is anything you can do? Is there a certain gift from the Spirit that He's given you that you think is for the benefit of the body? If you're filled with the love of God, you can do something. So do it. So maybe rather than say, if I can do anything, let me know, say, I'm coming over and I'm making you a meal. And let them say what? No. I'm going to come watch your kids so you can go out. Make them say no. I'm going to come over and pray with you. Now I'm just going to pray at home. And this is a caveat. When you tell people you're going to pray with them, I'm trying to do this. Just pray with them right then. It can be a quick prayer. Just pray with them. See, to be caught up in the life-giving love of God in the person of Jesus by His Spirit, we come to see that He has taken the initiative and He has something to offer us, and we have things to offer other people. And so rather than just being people who are like, let me know if I can do something, what do you think I'm going to do? Like text 48 people, I need this, and this? Some of you will do that, but most of us are self-sufficient Americans who will pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and to ask you for something is a sign of weakness. And you coming over and serving someone is actually defeating their pride, and it's a demonstration of love that the world will look at and say, why do you do that? Everyone can love others by just showing up and just by taking initiative. The third P is love one another with your possessions. 1 John chapter 3, previous chapter, he says, if anyone has material possessions and sees a brother or sister in need but has no pity on them, How can the love of God be in that person? Our culture tells us that our security is in our bank account. It's in our 401k. Our security is in our stuff. Our stuff is what gives us meaning, and to give our stuff away is to actually then tear apart the very basic identity and the very meaning that we define for ourselves. And so we hold on to it. And yet John says, if that is how we act, you don't know God's love. It is not present in you. To know God and to experience God frees you from the security in your stuff, and it allows you to give it away, all of it, if that's what God is asking you to do, and to do it freely and joyfully. Can you see now why, if we love these ways, the world will know that we're Jesus' disciples? And yet, the world doesn't know that we're Jesus' disciples because we don't just show up. We don't take the initiative and to go serve people, and we are so tied to our stuff. And yet the supernatural work of the Spirit reminds us that God, in His love for you, showed up for you in the person of Jesus, took the initiative and brought you into His family on His activity for you, and has now given you an identity that frees you from stuff. Spirit, we need you to give us this love, to cultivate it deeper in our hearts. We need to know more that, God, you showed up. You actively sought us out, and you have freed us and given us life. So, Spirit, I pray that you would help us to evaluate, to analyze where we need to grow, how we can grow. And Spirit, I pray that you just produce in us, in this church, at the church in Hampton Roads, a love that would actually demonstrate the life of God, your life to the world. I need it. I need to grow in it. And so help us to be these people. In Jesus' name we pray.